Most electric players are using the wrong strings for the wrong reasons, and they don't know it. They picked a set early, defended it for years, and blamed the guitar, the amp, or their own hands for the result. The choice almost never got examined. So here are 5 string types electric players reach for that are quietly working against them, and the short list of what actually belongs on most guitars. First, pure nickel. Pure nickel strings, the kind sold as Ernie Ball Classic Slinky, Fender Original 150, or D'Addario EPN sets, became fashionable again about 15 years ago when the vintage tone movement hit its second peak. The reasoning goes like this. The records people loved from the late 1950s and early 1960s were made on pure nickel strings, so if you want that tone, you put pure nickel strings on your guitar. It's the kind of logic that sounds airtight until you walk it through. Yes, those records were made on pure nickel strings. They were also made through low-wattage tube amplifiers, things like the original Fender Tweed Deluxe or the early Vox AC-15, driven hard into ribbon microphones onto tape, with players whose touch had been shaped by acoustic instruments. The strings were one variable in a chain of about 30. Pulling them out and assuming they carry the whole sound is the audio equivalent of buying a famous chef's knives and expecting the food to taste the same. What pure nickel actually does is soften the top end. The output is lower, the attack is rounder, the brightness drops off. On a 1959 Les Paul going into a Tweed Deluxe, that softness blooms. On a modern guitar with hot pickups going into a Kemper or a Neural DSP plugin, the same softness can read as muddy and indistinct. The note loses its edge, the chords lose their separation. The player turns up the treble, tweaks the EQ, swaps the pickups, and never finds out the answer was $8 away. If the rig wasn't designed to recover what pure nickel takes off the top, pure nickel isn't the right pick. And most modern electric rigs weren't designed that way. Second, Cobalt strings. Cobalt strings, sold as Ernie Ball Cobalt Slinky and a handful of similar sets from smaller brands, are among the most aggressively marketed alloys on the current market. The pitch is straightforward. Cobalt has a stronger magnetic relationship with pickups than nickel-plated steel. Therefore, the strings produce more output, more harmonic detail, more clarity. The number on the package is bigger, the graphics are louder. Players read the copy, compare it to the boring Slinky pack next to it, and reach for the upgrade. The trouble is the upgrade is solving a problem most players don't have. Modern pickups are already loud. A set of EMG 81s in a Schecter, a Seymour Duncan JB in a Les Paul, a hot pair of humbuckers in any guitar from the last 20 years has no shortage of output. Adding Cobalt to that signal chain doesn't unlock a hidden detail. It pushes an already hot front end further into harshness. The top end gets glassy and brittle. The pick attack feels spiky. Chords lose their roundness. Players who liked their amp before now find themselves rolling off the treble, dialing back the presence, and wondering what changed. There's also a fretwear question worth being honest about. Cobalt is harder than nickel-plated steel, and some techs report faster wear on softer nickel-silver fretwire, particularly with heavy vibrato or aggressive bending. How much faster depends on the player, the climate, and the fretwire itself, so the picture isn't as clean as marketing flip critiques sometimes claim. But the trade exists, and it's invisible at the cash register. The honest use case for Cobalt is narrow: a player with weak vintage-style pickups, a Stratocaster with stock single coils, a Telecaster with original spec bridge and neck, who genuinely needs more signal hitting the amp, and who likes a brighter, more cutting top end, can hear what Cobalt is offering. For everyone else, the alloy is delivering brightness and output the rig didn't need. Third, coated strings chosen for longevity. Coated strings, the category Elixir invented and now shares with D'Addario, XS, and Ernie Ball paradigm, are a real technology with a real use case. The thin polymer film around the windings keeps sweat and skin oil out of the gaps where the string corrodes. For a player whose hands are acidic, or who lives in humidity, or who plays infrequently and wants the set to still sound usable 2 months later, coated strings are a sensible purchase. Touring players who change strings less often than they should also benefit. The problem is, most players who buy Elixirs don't fall into any of those categories. They buy coated strings because they read that coated strings last longer than what is rarely specified. They put them on an Ibanez RG they play 3 times a week in a climate-controlled bedroom with clean hands, and they expect to change strings less. What they get instead is a slightly muted top end, a faintly slick feel under the fingers, and some extra weeks before the strings die. The trade is real on both sides. The question is whether the trade matches the player. Most electric players play often enough that their strings die from being played, not from corroding. Fresh D'Addario NYXL or Ernie Ball regular Slinky sounds and feels better than an old set of Elixirs for the first 2 or 3 weeks of life. A player picking up the guitar 5 days a week is inside that window every time they sit down. The longevity is being sold, and most don't actually need it. Fourth, flat wounds bought on aesthetic grounds. Flat wounds. The Tomastic Infeld Jazz Swing, the D'Addario Chromes, the Labella Deep Talkin' sets are jazz strings. They were jazz strings in the 1950s, and they're still jazz strings now, and there's a reason for that. The flat outer winding suppresses finger noise, dampens the high overtones, and produces a thumpier, woodier sound with significantly reduced sustain. On a Gibson ES 175 or a Heritage Eagle, played with a thumb or a soft pick through a clean polytone or a Henriksen, that's exactly the sound you want. What's happened in the last decade is that flat wounds got rebranded as the cool, unusual, vintage-flavored option. Players who don't play jazz on solid-body guitars through gain pedals started buying them. The reasoning was usually visual or atmospheric. Flat wounds look interesting on a jazz master in an indie band. They sound different in a YouTube demo. The string was picked up as an identity move, not a tonal decision. On a solid-body Stratocaster played through a Big Muff, D'Addario Chromes do something genuinely strange. The attack goes soft. The harmonic content thins out. Single notes sound mute and tubby. Pick scrapes don't work. Pinch harmonics don't work. Anything that depends on the upper overtones of the string just disappears. A small number of players love this and have built whole sounds around the contradiction. Mark Ribot is one. Most try them for 2 weeks, put up with the strangeness because they spent $25 on a set, and quietly go back to Slinkies when the flat wounds finally die. There's no shame in not playing jazz, and no shame in admitting the strings on the guitar don't match the music being played. Fifth, half-round strings. Half-rounds, the category sold as D'Addario. Half-rounds and GHS bright flats are pitched as the smart compromise. Round wounds are bright and noisy. Flat wounds are smooth and dull. Half-rounds, the marketing says, give you the brightness of one and the smoothness of the other. The string is wound with round wire and then ground or pressed flat on the outside, so the surface feels closer to a flat wound while the core construction stays closer to a round wound. On paper, it's the best of both worlds. On the guitar, it's neither. The construction itself explains why. Grinding the outer winding flat removes metal from the part of the string that vibrates against itself and against the air. That removal kills a portion of the high harmonics that give round wounds their sparkle, but it doesn't kill enough of them to deliver the deep, thumpy fundamental that makes flat wounds sound like flat wounds. The result sits in a tonal middle that doesn't resemble either reference point. It's a round wound with the top end shaved off, or a flat wound that hasn't committed to being one. Players who buy them for the brightness find them dull. Players who buy them for the smoothness find them noisier than expected. The feel sells better than the tone. Half rounds genuinely do reduce finger squeak compared to a fresh set of D'Addario EXLs, which matters for players recording fingerstyle parts or doing a lot of position shifts on a clean tone. That's a real and narrow use case, the same way flat wounds have a real and narrow use case. The mistake is treating the reduced squeak as a free upgrade rather than as one side of a trade. The honest version of what half rounds offer is this. If a player loves the feel of flat wounds but wants slightly more high-end articulation, they're worth trying. If a player loves the brightness of round wounds but wants less finger noise on recordings, they're worth trying. In both cases, the player already knows which reference point they're moving away from, and they're accepting a compromise on purpose. The trap is buying them as a default, expecting two virtues, and ending up with a muted version of one and a noisier version of the other. So those are the 5 missteps. Pure nickel on the wrong rig. Cobalt sold as an upgrade most players don't need. Coated strings bought by people who don't fit the profile. Flat wounds picked for the look. And half rounds chosen as a compromise that compromises both sides. The short list of what should actually be on the guitar is shorter than the list of mistakes. And that's the point. Start with nickel-plated steel in a standard gauge. This is the default. Ernie Ball regular slinky in 10s on most guitars, a Les Paul, an SG, an Ibanez RG, D'Addario EXL12, O in 9s on a Stratocaster, a Tele, a PRS Silver Sky, or any 25.5-inch scale guitar where 10 can feel stiff. Nickel-plated steel has been the industry standard for decades, from Ernie Ball Slinkies to D'Addario EXLs to GHS Boomers to Dunlop heavy cores. And there's a reason. It balances brightness and warmth. It holds tune. It's consistent from one pack to the next. It costs almost nothing. It doesn't announce itself. It just works. If there's no specific articulable reason to use anything else, this is what should be on the guitar. The absence of a special story isn't a flaw, it's the point. The strings get out of the way and let the rest of the rig do its job. Then there's stainless steel. These are for high-output rock and metal players. Stainless, the kind sold as D'Addario Pro Steels, GHS Progressives, or Dean Markley Blue Steel, is brighter and more aggressive than nickel-plated steel. The attack is sharper, the output is slightly higher. The strings last longer than nickel-plated steel, because stainless doesn't corrode the same way. The trade is that the brightness can feel harsh on certain pickups, particularly older single coils, and harder string materials can accelerate fret wear depending on the fret wire and the player. For guitarists running a Schecter Hellraiser, an ESP Eclipse, or an Ibanez RGA into a Mesa Mark Series or a PV6505, who need note separation through a wall of gain, who need the high end to cut without an EQ pedal, stainless is the right tool. It isn't the right tool for blues, it's the right tool for gent. And finally, coated strings. For the players who actually fit the profile, this is the only category that appears on both lists, and the reason is worth being explicit about. The error in Section 3 wasn't the strings themselves, it was the mismatch between the strings and the player. A bedroom guitarist with clean hands, in a dry climate, playing 5 days a week, doesn't benefit from coating because their strings die from use long before corrosion becomes relevant. The technology gets paid for and never gets used. The opposite profile exists, and it's larger than people think. A player who picks up the guitar twice a month and wants the set to still sound alive when they come back to it. A working musician who tours 20 dates in a row and can't restring before every show. A guitarist whose sweat genuinely is acidic, the kind whose strings turn black in a week, regardless of how often they're wiped down. A player in Singapore or Houston, where the humidity does most of the work of killing a string before the hands ever touch it. For all of those people, Elixir OptiWebs or D'Addario XS aren't a marketing upsell. They're the strings that solve the actual problem. The honest question isn't whether coated strings are good, it's whether the player fits the profile. If the answer is yes, the trade in feel and top end is worth it, and the set will outlast nickel-plated steel by a meaningful margin. If the answer is no, the trade is being paid for nothing. Notice what isn't on this list. Pure nickel doesn't make it, because most modern players don't have the rig to use it well. Flat wounds don't make it, because most electric players aren't playing jazz. The novelty alloys, the titanium-coated sets, the cryogenically treated ones, don't make it, because they tend to disappear again within a few years. The list is short on purpose. There's a tendency, among players who spend a lot of time on r/guitar or watching YouTube gear demos, to imagine that the answer to a tonal problem is a special string. The right string, in the right alloy, will unlock the tone they hear in their head. It almost never does. The tone in their head is usually a function of touch, of the amp, of the room, of pick choice, of where the pick meets the string, of how the guitar is set up, of about 15 other variables, of which strings are one. Strings can make a guitar worse. They can rarely make a Squier sound like a custom shop. The job of strings is to stay out of the way. The deeper trap is that strings are the easiest variable to change. A new set takes 10 minutes. A new amp takes a paycheck. A new technique takes a year. So when something sounds wrong, the strings get blamed, the strings get swapped, and the underlying problem, which is almost always touch or setup, never gets addressed. The player rotates through 6 brands in a year, never satisfied, never improving. The strings were never the bottleneck. The boring answer is the right answer. Ernie Ball regular slinky, or D'Addario EXL110, in the gauge the guitar is set up for, changed when the set starts to sound flat. A proper setup once a year, by a real tech, not a YouTube tutorial. The experimentation can wait until 6 months, with the boring strings has taught the ear what they actually do. By then, most players find they were chasing something the strings were never going to give them. And that's it. Comment down below, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more videos like this one.